The desert sun bled gold over the horizon as Martha Clay pushed her rusted cart through the town's garbage pit, her boots crunching over broken glass and old tin cans that shimmered like dying stars. Once she had been the wife of a proud rancher, but the drought of '68 had taken everything: the land, the cattle, and the man she loved, leaving her with nothing but debts and a tiny shack outside Red Mesa. The townsfolk called her the trash woman, laughing as she scavenged scraps to trade for flour and kerosene. But Martha had long stopped caring about names. Hunger doesn't listen to pride. That morning, as vultures circled lazily above and the wind howled through the dry ravine, she found something that would change her life forever. Behind a broken wagon near the edge of the dump, she heard a faint whimper, soft, weak, almost swallowed by the buzzing flies. At first, she thought it was a wounded pup, but when she pulled aside the torn canvas, her heart stopped. 3 tiny babies, their faces painted with the dust of the desert, wrapped in pieces of old cloth. Apache babies. Their eyes fluttered open, dark, terrified, innocent. Someone had left them there to die. Martha stood frozen, the air heavy with disbelief. In Red Mesa, hatred for the Apache ran deeper than the canyons. Don't touch their kind, the preacher had once warned. But as she looked down at the smallest one, reaching weakly toward her hand, something broke inside her. A quiet, stubborn flame of mercy, she thought, had died with her husband. Without another thought, she gathered the 3 into her arms, wrapped them in her old shawl, and whispered, "No one's throwing you away while I'm still breathing." The road home was long and rough, and she stumbled often, but by the time she reached her shack, the babies were asleep against her chest, their tiny breaths soft as forgiveness. That night, as rain tapped gently on the tin roof, she built a small fire and fed them warm milk drop by drop. She named them Ben, Clay, and Eli after the men she had lost, and promised them the one thing she could still give: love that didn't quit. Over the years, Martha became both mother and father, teacher and protector. She raised them on scraps and courage, collecting trash each morning and mending what others threw away: pots, tools, hope. The boys grew tall and strong, working side by side with her, defending her when townsmen mocked or stole her earnings. She taught them not to hate, even when hatred followed them. At night, they would sit under the stars, and Martha would tell them stories of the man she once loved, of the land that could forgive if you worked hard enough. The boys listened, their eyes full of something fierce and bright. She didn't know then that each lesson, each act of kindness, was shaping them into men the world would never forget. For 23 long years, the years rolled by like tumbleweeds across the desert, and under the blistering Arizona sun, Martha's 3 boys became men carved from struggle and sand. Ben, the eldest, grew quiet and strong, his shoulders broad from hauling scrap metal, and his hands calloused from fixing broken tools no one else could save. Clay, the middle son, had a spark in his eyes that never dimmed. He could turn a pile of rusted junk into something useful, almost beautiful, like his mother turned scraps of life into survival. The youngest, Eli, had the gentlest soul. He would sing to the coyotes at dusk, his voice soft and haunting, the kind of sound that made even the desert listen. Together, they worked every inch of that barren land, planting seeds in soil that everyone said was dead. But somehow, Things grew for them, small patches of corn, a few stubborn apple trees, and hope that refused to die. Martha watched them, with pride that words couldn't hold, her wrinkled face lighting up like dawn whenever the boys came home, dusty but smiling. Still, the town never forgot who they were. 2 Red Mesa's people. They were the trash woman savages, a reminder of everything they feared and refused to understand. The banker sneered when she tried to pay her taxes with coins earned from selling scrap. The preacher turned his back when she brought food for the hungry. Even children in the street whispered behind her boys' backs. "Ain't no good come from the dump," they said. But the boys learned from their mother's silence, from her way of turning insult into fuel. When one of them was called names, she would only smile and say, "Let the world talk, son. It don't build nothin' with its mouth." And so they built. They fixed fences for neighbors who once mocked them, helped wounded cattle across the river, and patched up roofs when storms came. Slowly, grudgingly, a few folks began to see them differently, useful, honest, loyal. The sheriff once said to Martha, "You raised good men, Miss Clay." She had just smiled, knowing he still wouldn't sit beside them in church. But good words were better than stones. The real test came one summer when a fire swept across Red Mesa. The wind carried flames like whips, devouring barns, homes, and dreams in minutes. While most men ran to save their own, Martha's sons rode straight into the blaze. They broke through fences, guided families out of smoke, and carried crying children through walls of heat until their clothes burned. When dawn broke, the town lay half in ashes, but because of them, many still lived. Martha's hair was singed, her hands blistered, yet her heart had never felt fuller. As the townspeople gathered what was left, the day the railroad men returned, the wind carried dust like a warning across the valley, swirling around Martha's shack as if the earth itself knew trouble was coming. Martha stood by the fence, her gray hair tied back, her weathered hands gripping the old wooden post her husband once set, her eyes steady as 3 black-coated men rode up with arrogance that smelled of whiskey and power. Their horses were sleek, their boots polished, their words slick with lies. "We gave you fair warning, Mrs. Clay," said the man in the middle, a thin smile cutting across his face. "This land's marked for progress, now railways comin' through, and your little trash kingdom's in the way." Martha didn't flinch. Behind her stood Ben, Clay, and Eli, shoulders squared, faces like stone carved by wind and years of labor. "We ain't sellin'," she said quietly. "Not now, not ever. This land fed my sons when no man in this town would give us bread." The railroad man's smile thinned into a sneer. "You think your feelings matter to men who build the future," he said. Ben took a step forward, his jaw tight. "Then you can build your future somewhere else." There was silence, the kind that comes before thunder. One of the men spat in the dirt. "You people never learn your place," he muttered. Then they left, but the promise in their eyes was cold as a gun barrel. That night, the moon rose pale and watchful as Martha's family sat by the fire. "They'll come again," she whispered. "They'll come harder." The boys nodded, and for the first time she saw real anger in their faces, anger that burned but didn't blind. They began reinforcing the fences, digging trenches, keeping rifles close but hearts steady. Weeks passed, and the tension in Red Mesa thickened like smoke. Some neighbors avoided them, Others warned them to give up before it was too late. "You can't fight men like that," one said. "They've got money, law, and guns." But Martha only smiled wearily. So did Pharaoh once. Then, one night, when the air was still and the stars hid behind clouds, the railroad men struck. They came with torches, a dozen of them, faceless in the dark, their laughter sharp as knives. By the time Ben woke to the smell of smoke, the barn was already burning. The brothers rushed out, fighting the fire with buckets and rags, but the flames were hungry. Eli ran toward the corral to save the horses, only to be knocked down by a blow from behind. Clay swung a shovel, his rage fierce, his mother's screams echoing through the chaos. "Leave us," she cried. But they didn't. Ben tackled one of the men into the flames, his fists flying until the man fled. When dawn came, half the ranch was gone. The barn, the tools, the hay, and one of the horses lay dead in the ash. The town said nothing. No law came, no help offered. Martha buried the animal herself, her tears falling silently into the dust. But when she stood again, something new burned in her chest. Not fear, not grief, but purpose. "They can take what's built," she told her sons, her voice trembling but strong, "but not what builds it. We'll start again." And so they did. The fire had taken their barn, but not their will. For weeks, Martha and her sons worked in silence, rebuilding fences from the blackened timber, turning ashes into purpose. The desert had always been cruel, but now it felt like it was watching, waiting. Every sunrise came with tension. Every creak of a wagon wheel made Martha's heart tighten. She'd seen hate before, but never this organized, never this rich. The railroad men had friends in high places, judges and sheriffs, who drank from their gold cups. And Red Mesa, it looked the other way. The same people whose homes her sons had saved during the Great Fire now crossed the street to avoid them. "Don't stir trouble," whispered the grocer. "You can't win against men like them." But Martha only smiled bitterly. "I don't fight to win," she said. "I fight to live." Then one morning, as dawn spread across the desert like spilled blood, they came again. This time, it wasn't to burn, it was to break. 12 men on horses, led by the same thin, mild foreman from before, rode up to the Clay ranch, with rifles slung low and malice in their eyes. Martha stepped out of the shack, her old shotgun in hand, her sons behind her. "You got your warning, old woman," the man said, smirking. "Now we take what's ours." His words were poison, but his tone was sweet as a salesman's lie. "Ain't yours," Ben growled. "It's ours by sweat." The man laughed, spit hitting the dust. "You think sweat makes you a landowner. You're just trash with a fence." He reached for his gun butt before he could draw. Clay fired into the air. "You'll leave now," he said, voice steady, though his hands trembled. For a heartbeat, the desert froze. Then everything exploded. Bullets cracked through the morning air, shattering silence, shattering peace. Horses reared, men cursed, dust and smoke swallowed the yard. Martha ducked behind a trough, praying under her breath. Ben charged forward, slamming one of the raiders off his horse, while Eli dragged his mother to safety. Clay took a bullet through his shoulder, but stayed on his feet, his rage stronger than pain. It lasted only minutes, but when the gunfire stopped, the ground was wet and red, and the smell of smoke returned. 2 of the attackers lay dead, one wounded, the rest galloping away in panic. But victory came at a price. Martha was bleeding. A stray bullet had found her side, tearing through the faded blue of her dress. She fell into Eli's arms, her breath shallow, her voice barely a whisper. Don't let hate make you what they are. Her hand trembled as she reached for Ben's face. Promise me. The boys nodded, but their eyes burned with something fierce, ancient, and unstoppable. They carried her inside, laid her on the bed she'd mended 100 times, and sat in silence as the night came. Outside, the wind howled, like mourning spirits, rattling the windows, carrying her last breath away. When morning broke, Martha Clay, the trash woman of Red Mesa, the mother who raised 3 Apache boys from death, was gone. The brothers buried her under the same mesquite tree where their father once lay, marking the grave with her favorite line from Scripture. What was cast away, God called worthy. And as the sun rose behind them, 3 shadows stood tall against the light suns, born of mercy, now driven by justice. The railroad men had taken their mother. Now the desert would take them back, one by one. The wind that swept through Red Mesa after Martha Clay's burial was colder than the desert had ever known. It carried silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that comes before judgment. The townspeople whispered, saying the trash woman's boys had gone mad, that they had left the ranch at dawn dressed in black, their horses carrying rifles, and grief heavier than steel. Ben rode in front, his eyes hollow, his mother's rosary tied around his wrist. Clay followed, his wounded shoulder wrapped in bandages, his heart stitched together only by rage. Eli rode last, quiet and pale, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the railroad tracks cut the earth like a scar. For 23 years, their mother had fought the world with nothing but love, and now the world would finally taste what it had sown. The brothers rode 4 miles through dust storms and canyons until they reached the camp where the railroad foreman and his men were stationed. From afar, it looked peaceful, campfires burning, laughter echoing through the tents. But beneath that laughter lived the same cruelty that had burned their barn and taken their mother. Ben dismounted first, scanning the ground, his hand brushing the old revolver his father once used. "We do this right," he said quietly. "For Ma, not for hate." Clay nodded, jaw tight. "She gave us life out of nothing. We give her justice out of everything." As night fell, the brothers moved like shadows through the camp. The desert wind howled through the rail beams, carrying whispers of the dead. When the first guard spotted them, it was already too late. Ben's warning shot shattered the lantern, plunging the camp into chaos. Men stumbled, shouting, reaching for rifles as flames burst from overturned oil cans. Clay and Eli moved with the precision of ghosts, disabling weapons, scattering horses, cutting off escape. But this was no massacre. They weren't there to kill everyone. They were there for one man, the thin-smiled foreman, the viper who had torched their home. They found him in his tent, still in his boots, fumbling for a pistol that was never fast enough. "You think you can scare me?" he spat. Ben stepped closer, shadows flickering across his face. "No," he said softly. "We're done scaring people. Now we teach." He tossed a bag at the man's feet, coins, jewelry, and the railroad's stolen deeds. "You built your empire on what you stole from the poor," Ben continued. "Tonight it burns." The man's face twisted with hatred. You'll hang for this." Clay leaned forward, eyes burning. "We've been hanging since the day we were born, before dawn." The camp was gone, the tracks sabotaged, the stolen gold returned to the town church, and the foreman left tied to the same rails he'd wanted to claim. The next morning, when the sheriff arrived, all he found was a letter pinned to a post with a knife. It read, "For every mother they buried in shame, the desert remembers." News spread like wildfire. Some called them outlaws, others called them heroes. The town of Red Mesa, once silent to their suffering, now whispered their names with awe and fear. The brothers didn't return home right away. They rode west toward the horizon, 3 silhouettes against the rising sun, their mother's spirit in every gust of wind. For the first time, the land felt alive, not with hate, but with justice finally done. And somewhere beyond the endless 23 years later, the desert had changed its face, but not its memory. The railroads ran silent now through Red Mesa, long after greed had turned to dust and the names of cruel men had been forgotten. Time had washed the blood away. Yet the legend of the trash woman and her Apache sons lived like a ghost story whispered around campfires. But one day, that legend returned to life. In a small church on the edge of town, a gray-haired woman named Sister Abigail swept the floors as she had for decades. She had been there the day the railroad came, the day the fire burned, and the day Martha Clay's grave was filled. She had watched from her window and done nothing, paralyzed by fear and the weight of a coward's heart. Her guilt aged her faster than the desert sun. So, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats one morning, echoing through the valley after years of silence, she looked up from her broom, and her hands began to shake. 3 riders approached, dressed in worn coats, their faces older, but their presence heavy with memory. Ben, Clay, and Eli dismounted slowly, their shadows stretching long across the churchyard. "Sister," Ben said softly, his voice cracked but kind, "you were the one who helped bury her, weren't you?" Abigail nodded, tears already gathering in her faded blue eyes. "I was," she whispered, "and I've prayed every day since." The brothers exchanged glances, the kind that carry both forgiveness and pain. "She used to talk about this place," Eli murmured, running his hand over the weathered wood of the church door. "Said someday this town might find its soul again." Abigail's lips trembled. It never did. But before she could speak further, Ben handed her a small, folded envelope, yellowed with time, tied with a piece of twine. "This was found near the grave when we rebuilt the ranch," he said. "She must have written it before the end." With shaking fingers, the old woman opened the letter. Inside was Martha Clay's familiar, strong handwriting. "If I'm gone, tell whoever's left that I forgive them. Tell them I raised my sons to give more than they got, to build where others broke, to love where others hated. My payback to the world is not revenge, it's what they'll become." Abigail's tears fell freely, wetting the old paper. She looked up, expecting anger, but all she saw was peace in the brothers' faces. "You came all this way just to forgive us?" she asked. Ben shook his head slowly. "Not just forgive," he said, "to finish what she started." From outside, the sound of wagons rolled closer, dozens of them. Families from neighboring towns arrived, carrying tools, lumber, and food. Behind them came a new signboard that read, "Martha's Haven, Home for the Lost." Eli smiled softly. "We rebuilt her ranch," he said, "for the orphans, the widows, the ones the world threw away just like her." Abigail covered her mouth, overwhelmed. "You turned her grave into a home." Ben nodded. "That's the payback, sister. Not bullets, not gold, mercy." The church bells began to ring, echoing across the valley, and for the first time in decades, Red Mesa felt alive again. Children ran through the dust, women sang as they worked, and the brothers stood beneath the same mesquite tree where their mother once rested. Clay whispered, "She was right. Love don't die easy." The wind rose softly, carrying the scent of rain, and for a brief, shining moment, it felt as though Martha herself was there, watching, proud and at peace. The town that